Hello and welcome. I'm Joseph77. The biblical Joseph built barns all over Egypt to gather the 7 years of harvest in order to feed the 7 years of barrenness. Neither Joseph nor Pharaoh at this time understood that such was the bounty of this harvest. It was sufficient also to feed the surrounding nations. Joseph and Pharaoh only realized this when the 7 years was apparent. At the start of the talks between Pharaoh and Joseph, neither understood that the 7 years of plenty was meant to also feed the surrounding nations. This is so important to my story because as a true 21st century Joseph, I have to convince the British people that what I offer to them is also something to offer the European Union and also the United States. The idea basically enshrined in the graphic of the draw. When you understand it, ladies and gentlemen, it is the most powerful idea all of humanity because it is something which the Almighty has already achieved. Now may I very quickly point out also the most distinguished illustration of that era, which we call colonialism, is the British Empire. And it is noticeable, and I only realised this in the past 10 years, that central to Her Majesty's speech, which a lot of people draw from that and say Her Majesty will never abdicate because it's in this speech. Well, it is conditional upon what is meant by her aspiration to save the British Empire. I'll talk about it in another video, but very briefly, central to that speech is an aspiration to save the British Empire. Now, I want to emulate the biblical Joseph, not by building barns, but something which is the equivalent of what biblical Joseph did, and it is to build small arboretums in local council parks, but take the idea from a central arboretum dedicated to Her Majesty the Queen, where the whole of the arboretum is meant to celebrate the British Empire and what it meant, and also to expose the terrible legacy of slavery. So in this arboretum, the central building, which we can take the views from all around the country and then gather those views into the central arboretum so we have a consensus of what it is that we want remembered to celebrate of the British Empire, which is a reflection of the era of colonialism, which is a reflection of what God gave to humanity through art and science, but its final reflection theologically that this is what was really meant by original intent in the Garden of Eden. So the central arboretum dedicated to Her Majesty the Queen would have a building perhaps called the Queen Elizabeth Hall, so we can have like concerts like the Royal Albert Hall, but something even more developed than that. I believe around the central hall you can have smaller buildings to celebrate different aspects of that particular colonial era. Outside in the arboretum itself, I would like trees to be planted in dedication to those who lost their lives in the pandemic. The tree can then be named after a person who died. It can also be named after a person who lived in that particular era that they admired, or even it could be even a slave that the life story of that slave has not been written. So there you go. And finally, I want it to be named after a tree. The tree named after a hymn that I regard as my spiritual grandchildren. So you have three things: something from the past, the present, and the future. Now, why this is similar to biblical Joseph planting barns is in this respect. The Central Arboretum collates all the ideas from around the country. So those little arboretums can be small plots of land given by the local borough council temporarily, so people can plant a small tree. When they mature, they can then be brought forth from the local boroughs all throughout the country, throughout Britain, brought to this new arboretum and then planted with a special ceremony to give them those 3 titles. In the local boroughs there will be, I've written a booklet, let me put it this way ladies and gentlemen, which outlines, the booklet outlines a service of commemoration for those who died in the pandemic. In the booklet there is guidance in which we discuss different aspects of the British Empire and of the colonial era in a broader perspective, not just the British Empire, but philosophically what that particular period meant. There you gather that the harvest of ideas, that is what is behind my idea of a central arboretum. So you see ladies and gentlemen, this is the small print that I prepared to devolve the big ideas in banner headlines. So let me reiterate ladies and gentlemen, a central arboretum named after Her Majesty the Queen to celebrate all the aspects of the colonial era. So it will notice the abuse of power in slavery, it will notice all the entrepreneurial zeal in that era, etc., etc. And finally the church should get involved in this because it is also a theological demonstration of what the Almighty has achieved for humanity to display his responsibility first through Christ, but more so through art and science. And I just briefly finish. The face of the drawer is meant to enable God's presence through the church to be in the midst of this wonderful civilization which was created as a direct behest of the responsibility of Almighty God to give to humanity intelligence to create a marvelous civilization. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is my expression of how to emulate the biblical Joseph by building barns. And I say this idea, central to the graphic of the drawer, is sufficient to also empower the European Union, our closest allies, and the United States of America. So this is a very pragmatic idea, ladies and gentlemen, which paints in detail of the banner headlines. Thank you. Revealed within by grace, a life contracted out to thee, a flight arisen from the dead, ascending with thy glory both, in giving more possess. The heat of our heart's desires, its yearning passion spent alone, give way to tenderness as this. True comforts in their secure bliss are in thine arms made known. Thy joy endowed before my way, a broken heart assembles whole. Unkept, this world prevails in vain. Thy promises in every part keep faith with thy dear name. All this the purchase of the tree, exchanged for all that I deserve. In dust I wait for thy return, when risen article and dress, the likeness of thee